In the quiet hours of the night, while the Roman governor and his wife lay asleep, Claudia was thrust into a vivid and unsettling vision, a dream unlike any she had ever experienced. In this strange dream, she saw a figure bathed in light, a man with eyes full of compassion yet shadowed by sorrow. He stood alone, his hands outstretched, reaching toward her. The crowd surrounding him surged with hostility and fear, their voices a tangled mix of anger and accusation, drowning out any chance of peace. It was as if the earth itself was quaking, the heavens darkening, casting long shadows across the crowd. And amid this chaos, the man's gaze seemed to pierce through the tumult, reaching straight into her soul. The intensity of the dream left Claudia breathless. Even as she woke, she could still feel his presence, his eyes burning into her memory. She sat up, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. In all her years as a Roman noblewoman, accustomed to political intrigues and the weight of her husband's position, she had never felt such a combination of fear and urgency. She tried to steady herself, to remind herself it was only a dream, a strange creation of the night. But something deeper told her that this was no ordinary vision. Claudia sat alone in the darkness, too shaken to return to sleep, each minute stretching into eternity. The man in her dream seemed both familiar and unknown, a paradox that unsettled her even more. Who was he? Why had he appeared to her, and why did his suffering feel so personal, as if it mattered to her alone, despite her distance from the turmoil of Jerusalem's daily struggles? Claudia had always been sensitive, often prone to unusual dreams. But this was different. This felt like a message, a warning, as if some divine hand had chosen her, of all people, to bear witness to something momentous. As dawn's first light broke through the horizon, casting a faint glow over the palace, Claudia's mind raced. Her thoughts circled back to one lingering question. What if this dream was not merely a vision, but a prophetic warning? She knew little of Jesus, but rumors had circulated about him for months. The Jewish leaders spoke of him with disdain, and the common people whispered of his miracles and his teachings with a fervor that was difficult to ignore. He was both revered and reviled, a figure who seemed to draw every eye and every heart. And now, for reasons she could not comprehend, he had appeared to her. Driven by a mixture of dread and determination, Claudia rose from her bed and made her way to a quiet corner of the palace gardens. She walked slowly, gathering her thoughts, letting the fresh morning air calm her. Birds chirped overhead, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air, but nothing could lift the weight pressing down on her heart. She could not escape the feeling that she was bound to this stranger's fate, that she bore some responsibility for what was to come. Her thoughts turned to her husband, Pontius Pilate. As the Roman governor of Judea, he was accustomed to making difficult decisions, balancing the needs of Rome with the volatile nature of the province he ruled. Pilate was not a man easily swayed by emotion, and Claudia knew he took pride in his role as a leader, often viewing it as his duty to maintain order at all costs. But would he understand the urgency she felt? Would he believe her if she told him of the man in her dream and the warning she sensed in her very bones? As the day wore on, Claudia's anxiety only grew. She replayed the dream in her mind, searching for any detail she might have missed, any sign that could help her understand its meaning. But each time, she was left with the same haunting image, the man's eyes filled with both love and sorrow, reaching out to her in silent plea. The more she pondered, the more she felt convinced that this dream was a divine message, one she could not ignore. Summoning her courage, Claudia decided she had to speak to Pilate. Though she knew he was often dismissive of her dreams, brushing them off as mere fancies or the effects of an overactive imagination, she also knew that this time was different. She could not explain it, but she felt an urgency unlike anything she had experienced before. This was not about political stability or appeasing the crowds. This was about a man's life, and perhaps something even greater than that. And in her heart, Claudia sensed that if Pilate condemned this man, the consequences would ripple far beyond Jerusalem, beyond Rome itself. When she finally approached her husband, she could see the tension already written across his face. His morning was filled with preparations for what promised to be a contentious trial. Pilate barely looked up as she entered, absorbed in the demands of his office. But Claudia would not be deterred. With a quiet intensity, she told him of her dream, of the man who had appeared to her, and the overwhelming sense of dread that had seized her. She pleaded with him to listen, to consider her words, to approach the coming trial with caution. Pilate listened, though with a mixture of skepticism and impatience. Claudia could see the strain in his eyes, the pressure of the decision weighing on him. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of doubt, a crack in his resolute demeanor. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the hardened resolve of a Roman governor. Pilate reminded her, gently but firmly, that dreams were not the basis of law and governance, that his duty was to Rome and to maintaining order. Yet, despite his dismissal, Claudia knew her words had struck a chord. She could see it in the way he shifted uncomfortably, the way his gaze avoided hers. She could only hope that her warning would linger in his mind, that he would remember her words when the moment came. For in her heart, Claudia knew that this man, this Jesus, was different from any other. She could not shake the feeling that he held a significance she could not yet comprehend, that his life and death would alter the course of history. As Pilate left to preside over the trial, Claudia was left alone, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and sorrow. She felt as though she had glimpsed a truth that was beyond her understanding, a mystery that lay just out of reach. And as she waited, praying that her husband would heed her warning, she could only hope that fate would be kind, that mercy would prevail, and that the man from her dream would somehow escape the tragedy she felt looming on the horizon. The day was unlike any other, thick with tension as rumors swirled throughout Jerusalem. From the early hours, people had gathered in the streets, whispering, speculating, and adding fuel to an atmosphere already rife with uncertainty and anticipation. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, felt the pressure of it building as he prepared for the trial, knowing that every decision he made in this volatile region could have repercussions he could barely predict. To Pilate, it was yet another day of managing the delicate balance between his duty to Rome and the insatiable demands of the local population. A delicate task in a land where even the smallest misstep could spark unrest. The figure at the center of this storm, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, was an enigmatic presence. Pilate had heard of him in passing before, rumors of a healer, a teacher, a prophet. His words had stirred people's hearts, yet his message threatened the authority of both the Roman state and the local religious leaders. Pilate could sense that this trial was different. His gut told him that he was dealing with a man who had, for reasons unknown, captivated a diverse group of people, from the poor and downtrodden to the educated and respected. As Jesus was brought before him, Pilate observed him carefully, scrutinizing his appearance. Unlike other prisoners who faced him with either defiance or terror, this man was calm, almost serene. There was a quiet strength in his bearing that caught Pilate off guard. Jesus did not shrink before his authority, nor did he look at him with contempt or hatred. Instead, he met Pilate's gaze with an unyielding compassion, as though he were the one offering solace to the Roman governor rather than pleading for his own life. Pilate felt an unsettling discomfort rise within him. Here was a man who did not fit into any category he was familiar with, someone who defied explanation. Pilate had dealt with zealots and rebels before, but Jesus was different. He lacked the fiery rhetoric, the hatred, the desperation that marked so many others who had challenged Rome's rule. Instead, he seemed almost indifferent to the worldly power Pilate represented, as if his mind was focused on something beyond the walls of the governor's palace, beyond the earthly laws that governed their lives. As the trial began, Pilate's frustration grew. The accusations leveled against Jesus were vague and conflicting. Religious leaders clamored for his death, claiming he had blasphemed by calling himself the King of the Jews, a claim that they insisted threatened both their authority and the stability of Roman rule. Pilate listened to their arguments, but he struggled to find any substantial evidence of a crime. Jesus had not incited a violent rebellion. He had not led an armed uprising. He had only spoken to people, preached to them, healed them. And yet, here he was, on trial for his life. The more Pilate questioned Jesus, the more he felt an inexplicable pull toward this quiet man. He couldn't understand it. He was a Roman, trained to be rational and calculating, to measure people and situations by their utility and their threat. But Jesus was not like anyone he had ever encountered. Pilate even found himself probing the nature of truth as he questioned Jesus, an unusual conversation for a man who normally dealt in the absolutes of law and order. The crowd outside grew restless, and their cries reached Pilate's ears, a reminder of the volatile situation brewing just outside the palace walls. Every decision he made today would be scrutinized by the Jewish leaders, by his superiors in Rome, and by the people of Jerusalem. The noise and the pressure mounted as Pilate weighed his options, trying to find a path that would satisfy the demands of the religious authorities without condemning a man he believed to be innocent. In the midst of the trial, Claudia's earlier words returned to him. Her urgent plea, her fear-filled eyes, she had begged him not to condemn this man, recounting the terrifying dream she had about him. Pilate had brushed off her concerns at the time, dismissing them as the imaginings of a troubled mind. But now, watching Jesus stand before him, he felt her warning echoing in his mind, like a ghostly presence that refused to be ignored. Could it be possible that Claudia's dream was indeed a message? Could this man, who stood so calmly in the face of death, truly be innocent, as she had insisted? Pilate's inner conflict became visible in his actions. He attempted several times to deflect responsibility for Jesus' fate. First, he sent him to Herod, hoping that the ruler of Galilee might take the burden off his shoulders. But Herod, after mocking and questioning Jesus, sent him back without passing judgment. Pilate was left with no choice but to confront the decision once more. In a final attempt to avoid condemning Jesus, Pilate presented the crowd with a choice, invoking a Passover custom where one prisoner could be released. He offered them a stark contrast. They could choose to free Jesus, a man of peace, or Barabbas, a known criminal and rebel. Pilate thought the choice was obvious, certain that the people would choose to spare the man who had done no harm. But to his shock and dismay, the crowd demanded Barabbas's release. Their cries for Jesus' crucifixion grew louder, their voices filled with a venom that shook Pilate to his core. Stunned, Pilate looked at the crowd and then back at Jesus, who remained silent. Pilate wanted desperately for Jesus to defend himself, to give him a reason, any reason, to spare his life. But Jesus did not speak. He stood as he had since the beginning of the trial, calm, dignified, almost otherworldly. His silence unsettled Pilate even more, as if Jesus had already resigned himself to a fate that Pilate could not understand. In the moments that followed, Pilate found himself struggling with an inner turmoil he had never felt before. He was a man of the empire, a governor whose sole purpose was to uphold Roman law and order. But here, faced with a man who seemed to embody a different kind of truth, Pilate felt powerless, unable to control the events unfolding around him. He knew that his decision would forever mark him, that he would bear the weight of this choice for the rest of his life. Finally, feeling trapped by the demands of the crowd and the pressure of his position, Pilate made his decision. But he did so in a manner that revealed his own struggle and doubt. He ordered a basin of water to be brought to him and, in a symbolic gesture, washed his hands before the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared, as if by this act he could absolve himself of the responsibility that lay heavily upon him. The austere was intended to satisfy his conscience, to distance himself from the verdict he was about to pronounce. But as Pilate looked down at his hands, still wet with water, he felt the emptiness of the act. The weight of what he was about to do remained with him, and he knew deep down that no amount of washing could cleanse him of the guilt he would carry. His declaration may have appeased the crowd, but it did nothing to ease the unease that gnawed at his soul. With a voice that betrayed his reluctance, Pilate finally pronounced the sentence: Jesus would be crucified. The crowd erupted in a roar of satisfaction, their bloodlust satisfied, while Pilate felt only an emptiness, a sense of irreversible finality. He had given in to the demands of the people, but at the cost of his own integrity, his own sense of justice. As Jesus was led away to face his fate, Pilate watched him go, feeling a strange pang of sorrow, a deep regret that would haunt him in the days to come. And though he had sought to distance himself from this man's death, he knew that he would never truly escape the memory of this trial. For in that brief encounter, Pilate had glimpsed something beyond his comprehension, a truth that eluded him, a mystery that would remain unsolved. In the silence that followed, as the crowd dispersed and his duties resumed, Pilate could not shake the feeling that he had been a witness to something beyond the realm of politics and law. His mind returned to Claudia's warning, to her desperate plea, and he wondered if he had ignored the one chance he had to act with true courage. But the decision had been made, and the weight of it now rested upon him like a stone, an invisible burden that he would carry long after this day had passed. Claudia paced the shadowed halls of the palace, each step heavy with mounting dread. The morning had passed with agonizing slowness, and though she had urged her husband to show mercy, to be cautious, she knew the limitations of her influence. She had done all she could, but the nagging sense of helplessness gripped her. Her mind was haunted by the vision she'd seen the night before, and as she tried to distract herself with daily tasks, the image of the man in her dream, his eyes sorrowful yet full of understanding, remained imprinted on her soul. As the trial progressed, fragments of rumors filtered through the palace, reaching Claudia's ears. She learned that Pilate had already met Jesus and was interrogating him, hoping to find a way to defuse the situation. She knew her husband well enough to understand that this was not a routine trial for him either. Pilate was known for his stern judgments and unwavering demeanor, yet she sensed his unease. The more she heard, the more she felt compelled to act, to intervene somehow. Despite the gulf between them that their positions and duties often imposed, she felt the weight of this day pressing down on her as though it were her own burden to carry. Unable to sit idly by, Claudia decided to send another urgent message to her husband. She carefully crafted her words, knowing Pilate was not a man easily swayed. She had to appeal not only to his logic, but to whatever small part of him might still be open to her plea. She wrote, her hand trembling slightly, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man, for I have suffered greatly today because of a dream about him." She hesitated over each word, trying to convey the magnitude of her fear without appearing irrational or overly emotional. For though she knew Pilate respected her in his own way, he was bound by the weight of his office, the demands of his authority, and the intricate web of loyalty to Rome. When the message was delivered, Claudia could only wait, her heart pounding as she imagined Pilate reading her words. She hoped, perhaps naively, that her appeal would reach him, that he would understand the urgency behind it. She imagined him pausing, if only briefly, considering her message before returning to the weighty demands of the trial. Yet, a part of her, the part that had lived beside him for years and seen the cold calculations that governed his decisions, knew that her words alone might not be enough. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Claudia tried to gather her thoughts, retreating to a quiet room where she could be alone with her emotions. She wanted to scream, to plead, to be heard above the clamor of those demanding blood outside the palace walls. Yet she was powerless, bound by the limitations placed upon her as a Roman woman, the wife of a governor whose duties took precedence over the voice of his conscience. She was expected to support him, to remain a background figure. But now, for the first time, she felt an overwhelming need to break free from that silence, to make him understand that this decision was different. The palace corridors were thick with whispers, rumors spilling from one servant to another. The crowd outside was becoming restless, and Claudia heard that Pilate had attempted to reason with the leaders of the temple, searching for any solution that might spare Jesus without igniting further conflict. Yet each attempt seemed to fall short, as if some invisible hand were guiding events toward an inevitable end. It was a fate that Claudia could feel but not explain, a tragic sequence unfolding before her that she was powerless to stop. Claudia's mind drifted back to the other women she had seen in the city, those who followed Jesus, women who would be devastated by his loss. She remembered their faces, the quiet strength in their eyes, the unwavering devotion they showed despite the risks they faced. She wondered if they too sensed what she did, this profound injustice, this looming darkness. She longed to reach out to them, to tell them that she too understood the loss they were about to endure. But she remained alone, her heart weighed down by the knowledge that her position allowed her no true outlet for her compassion. Desperation drove her to pray, something she seldom did, and even less so with the intensity she now felt. In the silence of the palace, away from the scrutiny of others, she whispered words of supplication, asking the gods, or perhaps the one true God, if he indeed existed, to intervene, to spare the innocent man who seemed to carry the world's suffering in his gaze. Claudia wasn't certain whom she was addressing, but she was certain of her need to reach beyond herself, beyond the tangible in a final act of hope. She considered running to Pilate herself, barging into the trial room, regardless of the consequences. She imagined standing before the crowd, pleading with them, urging them to see reason. But each time her mind entertained such ideas, she felt the weight of her role, the boundaries set upon her by society. Even if she could reach him, even if she could stand before the people, what difference could her voice make against the shouts of an entire crowd, against the priests and elders who demanded Jesus' death? Claudia remained isolated in her chamber, her mind torn between despair and a fragile hope that perhaps, somehow, Pilate would remember her words in his heart and act upon them. She imagined him standing before Jesus, seeing what she had seen in her dream. A man whose innocence was beyond question, whose suffering seemed destined to transcend any punishment Pilate could mete out. She clung to the hope that Pilate would see the wisdom in her plea, that he would grasp the significance of this man standing before him. As the hours passed, Claudia felt herself sinking into a sorrow she could not fully understand. She felt connected to Jesus' fate in a way that was both deeply personal and inexplicably distant, as if his suffering were somehow linked to the suffering of all humanity. The dream had opened her heart to a pain she hadn't known before, an awareness of the fragility of life, the cruelty that could arise from fear and misunderstanding. In her isolation, she sensed that she was witnessing not merely a trial, but a sacrifice, one that held meaning beyond anything her mind could comprehend. She thought of Jesus' followers, those who believed in him, and wondered how they would bear the sorrow that awaited them. In her heart, she wanted to reach out to them, to let them know that someone within the palace walls understood their grief, that she too felt the horror of what was unfolding. Yet she was bound, trapped within her own silence, her compassion hidden from the world. At last, she received word from a palace servant that Pilate had made his decision. Her heart sank as she heard the news. The crowd had chosen Barabbas, the notorious criminal, over Jesus. Pilate, yielding to their cries, had washed his hands before them, attempting to absolve himself of responsibility. The message struck her like a blow, the final confirmation that all her hopes, all her prayers, had gone unanswered. She felt her spirit shatter, as if some vital part of her had been lost in that decision. Claudia slumped against the wall, feeling the weight of despair engulf her. She had tried everything in her power, yet she had failed to prevent the tragedy that would soon unfold. Her vision, her pleading, her prayer, all had proven futile against the relentless tide of fear and hatred that had consumed the people. She could only imagine Jesus' face, that expression of resignation mingled with compassion, and feel the ache of knowing she had been unable to save him. As she remained in the quiet solitude of her chamber, Claudia understood that she was now forever marked by this day. She knew that, in some inexplicable way, Jesus' fate was bound to hers. She could not shake the feeling that she had witnessed the suffering of an innocent man, a suffering that would linger in her heart long after the events of this day had faded into history. Claudia stood in the shadows, her spirit broken, yet something deeper within her stirred. A faint, fragile hope that perhaps, despite everything, this was not the end of Jesus' story. She could not explain it, but the vision of him standing resolute amid the anger of the crowd lingered in her mind. And in that quiet moment, Claudia made a silent vow to remember him, to carry his memory in her heart, even if the world around her chose to forget. As she watched the sun dip low over Jerusalem, casting the city in a warm yet ominous glow, Claudia felt that she was witnessing the close of one chapter and the beginning of something she could not yet understand. The sentence had been passed, and the weight of it seemed to hang in the air like a heavy mist, oppressive and inescapable. Claudia received the news as if it were a physical blow, a deep ache settling within her chest. She could hardly breathe as she took in the implications. Pilate had condemned the man she had pleaded for, and though he had washed his hands before the crowd, she knew that no gesture, however symbolic, could cleanse him or herself of this dark act. There was no turning back. The fate of Jesus was sealed, and with it, a part of Claudia's own soul felt irreparably altered. Outside the palace, a strange, tense quiet had descended. The crowd's demands had finally been satisfied, and now a grim procession would begin. The people of Jerusalem, the very ones who had once hailed Jesus with palm branches and praises, were now prepared to witness his death. Claudia struggled to understand this transformation. How could the same people who once revered him now demand his crucifixion? How had the whispers of admiration turned into cries of condemnation? She had seen this dark side of humanity before, of course. As the wife of a Roman governor, she was no stranger to the ways in which fear, jealousy, and political maneuvering could corrupt even the most ordinary people. She had seen men betray their own families, citizens turn on each other, all in the name of power, survival, or simply to appease a restless crowd. Yet, this felt different. This felt like a betrayal of something sacred, a violation of a truth too profound to be understood by mere politics. When Claudia heard that Pilate had allowed the people to choose between Jesus and Barabbas, her heart sank. She knew of Barabbas, a man of violence, a true criminal by every measure of Roman law and common decency. He had been involved in insurrections, acts of murder and rebellion that had threatened the tenuous peace in Judea. Offering him as an option was Pilate's last attempt to sway the people, to give them a choice so clear that even they would be compelled to spare Jesus. But the plan had failed, as Claudia now learned. The crowd, manipulated by the priests and the elders, had chosen Barabbas, sealing Jesus' fate with a chant of chilling finality: "Crucify him!" Pilate, in his attempt to absolve himself of guilt, had performed the ancient rite of washing his hands. Claudia could imagine the scene, the way he would have called for water, letting it pour over his hands before the crowd, symbolically relinquishing his responsibility. And yet, she knew that gesture could never erase the stain of what had been done. Washing his hands would not cleanse his soul, nor would it rid hers of the complicity she felt for not having been able to stop him. In the dim, quiet hours that followed, Claudia felt consumed by a sorrow she could barely put into words. It was as if a part of her very being had been taken from her, a light extinguished, leaving only darkness in its place. She sat alone, her mind replaying the scenes she could only imagine. The moment Pilate handed Jesus over to the soldiers, the cheers of the crowd, the shocked expressions of his followers, the silence of those too afraid to speak. And then, the procession toward Golgotha would begin, a slow, tortured march toward the hill of execution. Claudia heard murmurs in the palace of the steps being taken to carry out the sentence. Soldiers were preparing, and a wooden cross was brought forward, one that Jesus would be forced to carry himself through the streets. Claudia had heard stories of these crucifixions, the brutal form of punishment reserved for the most reviled criminals and traitors. It was designed to be not just an execution, but a spectacle, a public reminder of Roman authority, a warning to all who might dare to oppose it. The image of Jesus, beaten, bloodied, carrying that cross through the crowded streets, overwhelmed her with a grief she could hardly bear. She knew he would be paraded through the very streets where people had once listened to his words, where they had been touched by his healing hands, where he had shown kindness and mercy. She imagined mothers clutching their children as he passed, afraid to make eye contact, fearing association with a man now condemned by the very system they relied upon to keep peace. She pictured those who had followed him, perhaps hidden among the crowd, powerless to intervene, stifling their cries of anguish as they watched him stagger beneath the weight of the cross. Claudia learned that Jesus had fallen several times under the heavy burden, each time pushed up again by the guards who saw his suffering as part of the punishment. She had heard that a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, had been forced to help him, pressed into service by the soldiers who grew impatient with the delay. The thought of this stranger, compelled to lift the burden of a condemned man, filled Claudia with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. Even in his darkest moment, it seemed, Jesus was not abandoned completely. There was still one willing to shoulder his cross, if only briefly. As the procession moved toward Golgotha, Claudia's mind wandered to the reality of what awaited Jesus at the end of his journey. She had never witnessed a crucifixion herself, but she had heard the harrowing accounts. The nails driven through flesh and bone, the agonizing process by which a person would cling to life as their body was pulled downward by gravity, their lungs collapsing slowly, suffocating inch by inch. It was a death of unparalleled suffering, designed not only to kill, but to humiliate, to strip away any shred of dignity. She wondered how Pilate could live with himself, knowing he had sent an innocent man to such a death. She wondered how he could look into her eyes tonight, knowing he had disregarded her warning, that he had sacrificed not only a man, but, in some way, his own soul. She could not help but feel as though her husband had turned a corner from which he could never return, forever tainted by this decision that would haunt them both for as long as they lived. But even as her heart broke for Jesus, Claudia felt a strange pull, a sense that his suffering held a meaning she couldn't yet grasp. She remembered his gaze, that haunting look of love and sorrow that had stayed with her since her dream. It was as if he had known this day would come, as if he had already accepted his fate, embraced it as part of a larger purpose. She could not understand how anyone could meet such a brutal death with that kind of acceptance, that quiet dignity. It was beyond human comprehension, and yet she sensed that Jesus was no ordinary man. As she sat in silence, Claudia thought about the life she had known before this day, the privileges and comforts of being a Roman governor's wife, the security she had taken for granted. Now, those comforts felt hollow, tainted by the blood of the innocent man who had been condemned within her husband's walls. She felt a fracture within her, a deep and irreparable divide between who she had been and who she was now becoming. Her heart yearned to understand, to find some meaning in this tragedy, to know why this man's death affected her so profoundly, even though she had never spoken to him, never known him beyond the stories and whispers. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting a harsh orange glow across Jerusalem as the crucifixion neared. Claudia could not bring herself to look out over the city, for she knew the crowd would gather there to watch. For many, it would be a spectacle, a moment of perverse entertainment, a morbid ritual of suffering and death. But for her, it was a tragedy beyond words, a dark stain that would mark this day in her memory for as long as she lived. In the final hours of that day, Claudia sat in solitude, feeling a pain so deep it seemed to bleed into her very soul. She knew that nothing she could say or do would ever change what had happened. But she also knew, with a quiet certainty, that she would never forget Jesus. His image would stay with her, haunting her dreams, lingering in her mind. She would remember the way he had looked in her vision, his face filled with compassion, even as he faced a fate of unimaginable suffering. And so, in her sorrow and grief, Claudia vowed to carry this memory, to honor the man whom her husband had condemned, to keep his spirit alive within her. She did not yet know how, but she sensed that his story would continue, that his death would not be the end. And though she was only one voice, hidden within the halls of power, she would remember him. She would carry his memory as a quiet flame, a light in the darkness, until the end of her days. As the final hours of daylight slipped away, a profound stillness settled over Jerusalem. Claudia knew that Jesus' crucifixion had begun. The very air seemed to carry the weight of it, a heaviness that seeped into her bones. From her vantage within the palace, she could not see the hill of Golgotha, where he was being executed, but she could sense the suffering in a way that defied words. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, bearing witness to a tragedy that transcended human comprehension. Reports from the guards and servants reached her, small fragments of information carried by whispers. Jesus had been nailed to the cross, his body suspended between earth and sky, in a position of excruciating pain and humiliation. Claudia tried to imagine the scene, to picture the rugged hill outside the city walls where a small crowd had gathered to watch. Some were there out of morbid curiosity, while others were there in mourning, yet too afraid to intervene. She could almost feel the collective sorrow of his followers, those who believed in him, who must have felt as though their own lives were ending along with his. Claudia's mind returned to the strange serenity she had seen in Jesus' face, the look of acceptance she had glimpsed in her dream. She could not fathom how any man could endure such a fate with peace in his heart. Every description she had heard of crucifixion painted it as a slow, agonizing death, a death of unimaginable suffering that was meant to strip a person of all dignity, leaving only pain and helplessness. Yet, from all she had heard, Jesus had shown no anger, no resentment. Even in his suffering, he seemed to possess a sense of calm, as if he were walking willingly into the darkness. Outside, the skies had begun to shift. The sunlight dimmed, casting an unnatural shadow over the city. It was as though the heavens themselves were mourning, darkening in sympathy with the suffering of this man. Word spread quickly that the sky had grown dark, as if some cosmic force was grieving alongside those who loved him. People murmured of a strange sense of foreboding, and even those who had called for his death began to whisper that this was no ordinary man. The darkness that covered the city was unlike any storm. It was a thick, oppressive shadow that seemed to chill the very air. Claudia's heart ached as she imagined Jesus on the cross, his body weakening as each moment passed. She had heard that he had spoken words of forgiveness to those who had crucified him, asking God to pardon them, for they knew not what they were doing. The sheer humility of that prayer left her breathless. How could he, in the face of such cruelty, still find the strength to forgive? It was beyond her understanding, and yet she sensed that this act of mercy would resonate long after this day had passed. She imagined the faces of those gathered at the foot of the cross, the weeping women who had followed him, his mother clutching at her heart in grief, his closest disciples hiding in the crowd, too afraid to come forward but unable to look away. Claudia felt a kinship with them, an invisible connection born of shared sorrow. Though she was separated from them by walls of stone and boundaries of status, she felt their pain as though it were her own. As the minutes stretched into hours, the sky grew darker, and Claudia felt a chill sweep through the palace. Servants scurried through the halls, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Word had spread that the temple curtain, the veil separating the most sacred inner chamber from the rest of the temple, had been torn in two. The news stunned her. Such an event was considered a divine sign, an omen that could not be ignored. It was as though some great, unseen hand had reached down from the heavens and split the curtain, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The people were beginning to realize that this death, this crucifixion, carried a significance they could not yet grasp. Claudia felt the urge to venture outside, to see for herself, but the boundaries of her position restrained her. She was expected to remain within the palace, to keep to her quarters while her husband fulfilled his duties. Yet she could not escape the feeling that she was connected to this moment, that she was bearing witness in some unseen way. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift, imagining herself standing at the foot of the cross, feeling the rough earth beneath her feet, hearing the cries and whispers of the crowd. As she sat alone, Claudia began to feel a profound emptiness settle within her, a deep sadness that seemed to touch the core of her being. She felt as though the world had lost something irreplaceable, a light that had been extinguished too soon. And in that stillness, she wondered if this was the end, or merely the beginning of a story that would echo through the ages. More time passed, and Claudia received word that Jesus had spoken his final words. "It is finished." The words struck her like a thunderbolt, carrying a weight that transcended their simplicity. They were not words of defeat, but of completion, as if he had accomplished something vital, something beyond human understanding. She could not explain it, but she felt that he had fulfilled a purpose, that his life and death held a meaning she could not yet grasp. Then a tremor shook the ground, a deep rumble that reverberated through the palace walls. Claudia felt it beneath her feet, the unmistakable sensation of the earth shifting. Servants gasped and clutched at the walls for support, their faces pale with fear. People spoke of the earth quaking near Golgotha, as though creation itself were mourning, unable to remain still as this tragedy unfolded. Claudia heard frantic voices outside her door, people wondering aloud if the gods were angry, if this was some kind of divine judgment. And in her heart, she felt a strange certainty that these events were indeed connected to the man on the cross, that his death had stirred forces beyond human control. As the tremors subsided, Claudia remained still, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and terror. She sensed that she was witnessing something sacred, something that would leave its mark on the world for generations to come. The city had grown eerily quiet, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for some revelation. The darkness persisted, an unnatural gloom that seemed to shroud the city in mourning. In the hours that followed, the weight of grief settled upon her. She realized that her life would never be the same. The man who had haunted her dreams, who had inspired her to plead with her husband, was gone, his life extinguished in a brutal act of violence. Yet his memory would remain, a light that would continue to shine within her. She could feel his presence even now, as if his spirit lingered, watching over those who had loved him, forgiving those who had condemned him. Claudia felt a deep resolve within her, a vow to carry his memory, to ensure that his story would not be forgotten. She would remember his eyes, the gentleness and wisdom they had held, even as he faced death. She would remember his words of forgiveness, his prayer for those who had harmed him, a prayer that seemed to transcend human limitations. And though she did not yet understand the full significance of his life and death, she knew that he had left an indelible mark on her soul. As night fell over Jerusalem, Claudia gazed out over the darkened city, her heart heavy yet strangely hopeful. She could not shake the feeling that this was not the end, that something greater was at work. She thought of his followers, of those who would mourn him, and she felt a kinship with them, a bond that defied the boundaries of status, power, and distance. She, too, was a follower in her own way, bound to him by a dream, by a moment of recognition that had changed her life forever. Claudia whispered a silent farewell to Jesus, a promise to keep his memory alive within her. She knew that his life and death would continue to echo in her heart, a quiet presence that would guide her in ways she could not yet understand. And as she sat alone, enveloped in the darkness, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that his story, his message would endure, that the light he had brought into the world would never truly be extinguished. In that quiet moment, Claudia closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe that this was not the end, but the beginning, that in some mysterious way, the man who had died on the cross would live on, his spirit woven into the very fabric of creation.